Welcome to the after show with 3 volunteers. We do it because it must be done, because no one else can. Because if we don't do this after show, millions will die, and that is what sets our people apart. This is 1,000 years of sacrifice going into what must be done, and all victories come inevitably at a cost. The Chernobyl after show starts now.
You're tuned in to AfterBuzz TV, the ESPN of TV talk. Now, let the buzz begin.
Yes, indeed, this is the Chernobyl after show, and we are here making tremendous sacrifice. I'm Christian Bladt. I have 400 rubles in my pocket. Joined by my excellent panel. Introduce yourselves.
I'm Jeremy Dann, professor at the Marshall School at USC.
Hey guys, I'm Julana Dizondiscuss.
And I want to just start big picture, overall, what you both thought of the episode. Julana, overall thoughts, and what's 1 or 2 things that just really stood out as you were watching?
Well, I think you've already quoted all the favorite notable quotes in our intro.
I used them all up. Good night, everybody. Good night, comrades.
No, but I was really nervous this whole episode, especially the way it ended. I mean, I was like, no, I need to know what's. I was worried for them, so
Yeah.
I really felt a lot of emotion in this episode throughout the whole time.
Yeah, and I think there's a lot of moments in which it's, uncomfortable, and there's a lot of things where you wonder, like, for example, and we'll go through some of these specifics, like when they first say, we'll fly the helicopter over the fire, and Legasov is like, no, we'll be dead within a week. And then the guy's like, yeah, I'm not going to fly over that. Jeremy, what were some of first of all, overall thoughts, and what were a couple of things that stood out for you in this episode?
First of all, the show is doing an amazing job educating, putting drama in front of us, putting human instinct and human emotion in front of us. One reaction is doing a great job, and really glad I'm involved with this show and watching this. Secondly, as someone that remembers this from kind of childhood and teen years, and also has read about it since, if possible, the stakes were even higher than I thought they were at the time. When we heard the stats about the explosion caused by potentially a meltdown going into the water, it wasn't just the radiation that was a risk. It was literally an explosion of steam. And when I heard that stat, I said, how big can that be? Well, they said 2 to 4 megatons, which if you run those numbers, Hiroshima was a 15 kiloton bomb.
Right.
The potential for that water to blow up was 200 times stronger than the bomb that dropped on Hiroshima from just steam expanding, with the shrapnel being plutonium, uranium, and every other radioactive substance in the world. So I was shocked by that statistic alone, and the consequences were even bigger than I thought they were at the time.
Yeah, and I mean, that's something that they highlight in the episode. I mean, you mentioned Hiroshima, and there's a point where Legasov he uses it as a great way to explain it that helped me understand it. It's like having 2 Hiroshimas every hour, and at that point I believe it had been the previous 48 hours, and that was going to be continuing forward. Julana, I like that it seems to be once, and this is, I think, bureaucrats of any stripes. I don't think it's just in the Communist Party, but once there's an official story, everybody sticks with it. It's like, yeah, I believe it's just like getting a chest x-ray. We heard that again. Mm-hmm. Were you surprised that people were still basically peddling a notion that it was, just a chest x-ray?
Yeah, I mean, like I said, I didn't know that much about Chernobyl.
Sure.
In my lifetime.
Yeah, when we spoke about it last
week,
yeah.
Right. And I'm just like, as the episodes go on, I'm just dumbfounded that people really stuck to that story so intensely and just kept up with it. And, because of the time and age that it was, and, it's obviously very different from how we live now, it was able to go on like that for a significant amount of time to really impact people.
And we have our own bureaucracies, as you said,
Sure,
and there is a party line even in a 2-party system. I'd say luckily we do have the check that we see they didn't have with the government-controlled press. But hopefully we'll get better health and danger and evacuation statistics when the time comes.
Yeah, people in this country, when they throw around the concept of fake news, I don't think they ever understood what Pravda was, which was the fakest news ever. And of course, you're talking about a two-party system. The communist Soviet Union was basically a no-party system. It was the party was everything, so there was no opposition. To circle back to sort of. So later in the episode, Jeremy, in our special segment, you're going to give us a lot of some hard numbers and kind of putting into context just how serious this was. I like the way that they conversationally, and Legasov realized pretty quickly that I'm going to have to, speak down, but also simplify the way I'm trying to explain this. So when the chest X-ray comes up, and that's early in the episode. This is a very important character moment. There's two incredibly important moments for him in this episode. The first is when he hits the table and says, "No, I can't let this go." Because he had read that report. It said graphite was found on the ground, and
said smooth mineral, a smooth rock,
true.
essentially,
and it had to be graphite. So he knew it was graphite. And then again, the party line, the bureaucratic line is, well, it couldn't be graphite. And it's just because of what that signifies, it's not possible. And so when he speaks up, though, this idea of the chest X-ray, the first thing he says is, well, it's not a chest X-ray. It's 400 chest X-rays. But looking at it more closely, he's like, it's 4 million chest X-rays. So, Julana, we go from a chest X-ray to 4 million. And, look, when you get the quick, when they do the dental X-rays, it's like a second. And they still put that lead thing, and you're supposed to make sure it goes over your neck to protect your thyroid, as factors into the show. So I don't know. I mean, did that help you grasp the severity of it, that it went from one chest X-ray to 4 million?
Yeah, of course. And another thing that I got from that scenario when they were in that scene in the boardroom is that somebody told him it's disgraceful that he's spreading information like this, trying to spread the real information. Like you said, they kept wanting to deny it because they didn't want to wrap their heads around what that would actually mean if that were to be true.
Yeah.
So that really drilled it in for me.
Yeah, I mean, that's one moment where that happens. And then we'll jump ahead briefly. Jeremy, when he and Boris land on the site, those guys are like, "Oh, look who's here. It's the troublemaker." And within under 5 minutes, those guys are dragged off to the gulag or possibly shot, because it was just like, okay, so you guys have really effed this whole thing up. It's actually all your fault. I'm going to take over. We don't need you anymore. Sort of talk about both of those instances and how indicative it is of a communist system.
Well, what's interesting is, remember when he came in, he wanted to deliver the facts. This is Legasov, played by Jared Harris.
Yeah.
And he starts delivering them, and he was being accused of being an alarmist, which is a really important word in the Soviet Union at the time. And he said it's not an alarmist. It's not alarmist if it's a fact.
Correct. Yeah.
And then the other thing is, though, when Gorbachev calls him on it and says, essentially, you're engaged in conjecture and you're a man I don't even know. He does realize at that point he does have a political game to play, that minutes and seconds count here, and that he can't just be the table pounder that he was in the first few minutes of the meeting. He has to be more compelling to the people that can marshal the resources faster. And he changes his style, and he even says, "May I express myself more calmly and more respectfully." And then later, when you're referencing he gets to the site, I think he had, after some rough patches, built with Boris Sherbina, played by Stellan Skarsgård, a little more of the credibility on the flight and early when they were on the ground, to the point of, as you mentioned, when Fomin and Burakhanov were criticizing him.
I'm going to go with that pronunciation. That sounded good to me.
Exactly. They started trying to have critiques and criticizing him of again, being alarmist. He soon thereafter sends them back to the party headquarters, where I imagine they have a few rooms they could keep them in for a few months.
Yeah, for as long as they're breathing. And honestly, because of where they were, their life expectancy wasn't very long, which is something that comes up several times in the episode. And I think that when we have it's not even an uneasy truce, it's a very hostile partnership that Legasov and Boris are put together on. And even so much that while they're on the helicopter, he's like, explain to me how this works. And he's like, great, now I understand how a nuclear plant works. I don't need you. And it goes from that to somehow he makes him understand the reality, Julana, that it's, well, we're going to be dead in 5 years. And he apologizes for saying it so bluntly, but you can kind of see in that moment and in everything he does afterwards, he knows that he, just by being where he's been, his life expectancy is not much longer, right?
Right. Well, and that's another thing. It's particularly in the helicopter scene. I imagine that it's hard for his character, being one of the only ones that really knows the, entirety of what's happened and knows all the factors and the consequences of it. Like, how do you convince people that don't want to know what's going on? You have to say it bluntly. You can't really go around it and be like, well, it's not really that safe. You have to be like, we're going to die. If you do this, you'll die.
Yeah, and I think when we get to the special segment later, Jeremy, the idea of if this were left unchecked, how many people would have died, and the amount of land that it would have impacted. But even as it was, there were reports of radiation in I think they said Munich, but it was in Germany. So it went that far.
That was Frankfurt, where they're saying they're not allowing the kids to go outside.
And the kids weren't going outside, and meanwhile the kids in the town were marching off to school the morning after the fire. So the meltdown. So yeah, and just to, I did want to get back to the Communist Party for a second. I think this problem would have been so much bigger had it been a little bit more of the old guard of whether it be Brezhnev or Khrushchev or the recent predecessors of Gorbachev. I think he was definitely someone who was more open to, why is this guy pounding at the end of the desk? Let's listen to what he has to say, instead of this guy pounding at the end of the desk, let's string him up by his feet in the town square and let people poke him with a stick.
We know Gorbachev now as the champion behind glasnost and perestroika,
Sure.
openness and restructuring. But at the time, he was still an unknown to the West, and really because he was elevated so much within the Communist Party, he was pretty unknown in the Soviet Union at the time. For a little context, over the previous, I think, about 3 years, the Soviet Union had 3 leaders. Brezhnev died in 82. Yuri Andropov was there to 82 through part of 84. Konstantin Chernenko for just about a year. And Gorbachev came in March of 85, and now it's about a year later. Obviously, he's gotten a little more known both nationally and internationally. But this is someone that didn't have a lot of credibility at that point on the international stage, and probably a lot of trust with the world leaders, and that domestically probably still hadn't consolidated his position. So he was just out of a summit with Reagan, where he was building a little bit of a relationship. Reagan even commented, it's hard to build relationships with the Soviet leaders because they keep dying on me. They literally were dying in office as old men. So he was a young leader, very different than what the Soviet Union had experienced over the previous 30 years, probably about 15 to 20 years younger than their average leader, and a very unknown commodity at the time.
Julana, both Jeremy and I remember the figure of Gorbachev. I mean, even as a kid, it was very recognizable. I mean, there were puppets and cartoons and things that really played off on that birthmark he had on his head, which, just looking back tells me, like, how well connected and good at his job he must have been. That the fact that he had that birthmark didn't hinder him in any way. He was able to sort of go past it. What are your thoughts as you see him? And because as we've established, this is all before your time, literally before your lifetime. So what is your understanding of him as a figure just heading into this?
Well, first of all, I heard in an interview that they did a great job recreating his wine birthmark or wine mark.
That's got to be, yeah. I mean, it's true. It's got to be a lot of work because you got to get it just right. Yeah, and if it's hot on the set and that actor goes like this, for our listeners that are can't see, he just rubs his head basically. Yeah.
Well, my first impression of him, based off that scene where they're all kind of like sitting around the table. he came off to me as somebody that was understanding because of the fact that, you know, he realized, I don't know, he said, I don't know who you are. You're just some man in my room that I've never met yelling at me. But he still understood and sensed that there was something maybe that he needed to listen to from this man. So he kind of, like you said, he didn't just cast him out. He gave him a chance to explain himself and then really kind of took that into account. And honestly, at the end of that scene, I felt really bad for him because he just looked so stressed out. And I mean, why wouldn't he be? Because he's had all this information dumped on him and all these huge decisions that he has to make. And like when he just walks out of the room, I was like, man, I really feel bad for that character right now.
Right. I mean, because of and you're talking about Gorbachev, right?
Right.
Yeah. So any leader, it's like, so this is one of probably dozens of crises that he has to deal with during the course of the day. This being, you know, one on such a grand scale. At that point, he doesn't quite realize the severity. But yeah, you're whisked out of that room to go in another room where there's another table of people that are going to tell you, here's another problem. So yeah, I don't know how people ever decide, yeah, I want to be that guy. I want to be premier of Russia or Soviet Union. I want to be the president of the United States. Before we move on, I know that Julana has a very important message for all of us.
Yes, very, very important.
Jeremy almost,
Sorry,
Jeremy
I just
did spill his
almost-
drink.
I spilled the drink.
That's the leakage down
Yeah.
through the reactor
well,
core.
We're going to have to put on the
We're
suits
reenacting.
to actually go through that spill, and I'm not volunteering. I'm going to stay on this side of the desk.
All right, I'll take it over. But okay, guys, before we move into our next topic here, we just want to say, first of all, thank you so much for making us the ESPN of TV Talk. And we need your help for us to be able to continue to grow here at AfterBuzz TV. Please, please make sure you subscribe to us on YouTube. If you're listening to us on iTunes, leave us a 5-star rating and some comments. And we love having you be a part of AfterBuzz TV. So if you're with us on YouTube watching live or watching after the show, just leave comments. We love to hear what you guys think about the episode and also be able to engage with you live. So thank you for supporting us and keep watching.
And if I could say something about this show and us commenting on Chernobyl, if you're one of the early adopters, so to speak, it's time to get your friends watching it and watching this, because then there's way more to talk about. And I think over the next few weeks, there's going to be a lot of deep, great, important discussions about this show.
Right. I think also when you do a miniseries in this style where it's once a week, you know, I mean, look, it's a 5-part miniseries. You could very well have run it Monday through Friday. And I think it tends to build because people are talking about how they're watching it. It's very easy to get caught up when you have a whole week between episodes. So I do think that the conversation is just going to grow. And we appreciate, we had quite a few people who watched our first show, so we thank everybody for being a part of that. I want to move on to a very significant character who is introduced in this episode, Julana Khomyuk. I'm doing really well with those. Played by Emily Watson. Probably henceforth I'll refer to her as, you know, Emily Watson's character. Now, in the little bit after the episode, there's some behind the scenes stuff. One of the things that they talk about is that this character is not a real person. It is an amalgamation of, I think they said, dozens of scientists who also sort of reverse engineered and figured out the idea that, no, we're not being told the truth. There are a lot of these signs. And I love the way that it was explained that you had all these people trying to solve a mystery that they, as in the party, the bosses, you're basically the people who run the country, don't want you to solve that mystery. And they just allude to the fact that people were put on trial, their families were threatened just for trying to do that. I think from a storytelling standpoint, I understand having one person represent it. It didn't bother me to have that realization. What did you think about that, Julana?
I thought it was a good decision because just to make the story a little bit more simple and be able to grasp really what's going on, I don't think there would have been a need to have really more than one kind of opposing factor coming in and delivering that information. You know, it wouldn't have made sense to have, say, like 12 people on the scene all figuring out.
Right. I mean,
what's going on.
there's already a lot of characters in this show, and not everybody has these cheat sheets that Jeremy made for us.
I do hope they still almost pay tribute to the fact that they were getting phone calls and data, satellite images, whatever it might have been that did help them solve it. So it's great. She's a boss of a character, great acting, is really conveying important information as a strong character, but I hope we see her interact with some people, etc.
Yeah, I think the Russians are definitely tapping this show. So
they're calling on the hotline.
Yeah, exactly. It's the red phone. One of the things that I think is interesting artistic license is in creating this character, but I feel like we need to sort of address the idea that it's a female character, and I don't know how far a woman in the Soviet Union is going to be able to go. Like, I don't think she gets past that police blockade. Now, one of the things that we learned from another show set in this time period, The Americans, is that women did have higher up roles in the party. But I was doing a media interview earlier today about a bunch of different stuff. This came up. The host brought up this character, and she was actually annoyed that it was a woman. And I was like, I don't know. I feel like that could be, I think that the way that the police officer is just like, fine, I'm going to arrest you and bring you to. It's just more like, I don't want to deal with you. I'm going to let somebody else deal with you. Give me your thoughts on all that, Jeremy.
I don't think women were still amongst that highest party and governmental level. I don't think there were women that were known on the international stage from the Soviet Union as politicians and leaders and diplomats in that way. But in medicine and the sciences, they really did, I would think, even favorably to the U.S., have a lot of experiences and exposure for the post-war period. So it's definitely something that I think is in character for the Soviet Union, so to speak, that there was a female physicist that had a high position. Maybe I think we only had at the governmental table one woman minister around that. That sounds about par for the course, but I'm glad that that character is a female character, and I think it is fairly indicative.
I also think without this, we would have we'd have really no female characters except for the nurses and doctors and the firefighter's wife. They're characters that I feel like we'll see more of, but I think it's just a lot of guys with British accents talking to each other, and I think that just from a enjoyment standpoint, I think she does a great job, and that mixes it up. Let's talk a little bit about how quickly she realizes what's going on. It just really takes opening the window, and their little radiation sensors go off. What do you think, Julana, about her? The theory that seems to be prevailing is like, no, it couldn't be Chernobyl. It's too far away. And the quote that I wrote down is she said they'd have to be split open. So like she says basically, well, the core would have to have exploded, which of course wouldn't happen. What do you think about just how quickly she's able to put it together?
Well, it was nice to see somebody pick up on it so fast. And I mean, they said she was a nuclear physicist, so this is her area of expertise. But the fact, and obviously it's a TV show, so everything goes quick. But
yeah.
Hopefully it was like this also in real life. But like you said, they open the window, the alarm goes off. Because they have that knowledge and they've studied these things, they're able to put the pieces together and start making the phone calls and looking into it. But also from that scene, one of the things that struck me was, wow, like really the only people that have not been affected at all is like maybe people that have not gone outside. Right? Because if they had all the windows closed and all the doors closed, if that was the first time someone opened the window and some particles were coming in, that too is a crazy thought.
Yeah, I mean, just the reach that it has, and I don't know the actual distance where, because I think they were in were they in? No, they weren't in Kiev. I forget where they were.
They were
in
in
Belarus.
Minsk.
Oh, Minsk.
Yeah, that's it.
So Chernobyl, Pripyat, is right on the border between Ukraine and Belarus.
Right.
So it's not as close as Kiev, but it is still a pretty close city to that.
Yeah, so I think that realization, and I think that there's the great scene when she tries to bring her information to someone, and whomever that party official is, who had previously been a was it a
Shoe factory foreman.
factory, yeah. I think that's indicative of two things, Julana. One, the way that, obviously political appointees aren't really that invested in their job. And also that, no one really wants to hear something that isn't the official story. And then the third thing being like, well, she's a woman. What is she possibly going to know? Did you feel like they did a good job conveying all of that in what's a relatively short scene, actually?
Mm-hmm. Yes, I did feel that they conveyed all of those things. And just her whole little short journey to finally get up to the people that she needed to talk to. I thought it was very interesting, when she got stopped by the guard and she was like, you're going to have to take me to your highest, power.
Go ahead.
She navigated that in a great way. Like, please freaking arrest me and take me to the warden and take me to, the chief of police and any military police general. And I don't know if she did a great job with the first Communist Party official in Minsk, because maybe there wasn't a job to be done. You mentioned political appointees, even less pressure than you would have today. People, we've seen 6 or 7 cabinet officials removed because of some political pressure in the United States. I still hope we have that as something that could force out people not doing their job. But this is someone that essentially, his line, which was just awesome. I prefer my opinion to yours. And this was maybe on the issue of, a man in the system to her, but it was definitely a politico to a scientist, which is something that we see play out in our society as well. And this script and this story was played out a lot written and developed before our current political climate was in place, and it resonates in very important ways.
So while Khomyuk is getting herself closer to Chernobyl, Legasov comes up with the solution of boron and sand, and I like that sort of her conversation with her assistant is he says,
I love
yeah,
that
he's
scene.
like boron and sand. He's like, yeah, that's what I do, and she's like, yeah, of course that's what you would do. And just the explanation of like why that creates a problem.
Boris and Simka.
Yeah, yeah. Well, yeah. So Simka is the general that's there. Is that no? Who's that?
So I want to make sure the viewer saw that. Rewatch the scene. It's really cool. She was talking to a plant.
Oh, okay.
I think the secretary at Legasov's nuclear agency.
Oh, right. I see what you're talking about.
The secretary had a periodic table of elements
Yes.
on the table and said Boris and Simka, which is B boron,
Right.
Boris, and Simka, Si silicon, which is boron and sand.
Which that's the coded conversation
Yeah.
that lets her know what's actually going on without talking about it, which I feel like is par for the course in the Soviet Union. But I don't want the conversation to get too far away from us because we don't have that much time. I just wanted to kind of talk about the way that they handle it when they get to the plant. And now we were talking before we started, and I've already forgotten the character that I'm talking about, the one who takes the responsibility of, no, I'll be the one to go in and take a look. I don't know if we have his name, but he gets into the truck and...
Piccolo, that's the general on site.
Right, and he certainly isn't the one who would have to go in. You know what I mean? It's just like you could have several underlings. And look, Legasov makes the point. It's like you can go in with all the shielding and everything, and it might not be enough, but he still goes in. And I'm more interested in when the truck comes out and they're washing it and there's just all that sludge on it, and he wasn't there for very long. All he did is basically ram the gate and take a look and then come back. So we're really starting to get the sense for how severe this problem is. I think
What a chilling line. It's not 3 Röntgen, it's 15,000. So the problem is 5,000 times as bad as these bureaucrats are saying.
right, and that comes up in that meeting with Gorbachev, that the 3 Röntgen is all that they're able to report because, as was established in episode 1, that's as high as they go. And Legasov immediately figures that out. And then just the idea of just how much there is, it's... I don't know. What do you think, Julana? Just sort of every step closer they get, both literally and figuratively, it's worse than anybody expected, right?
Yeah, I don't know. For me, it's just like, because we know obviously how bad it is, but thinking from being inside the episode, obviously the characters don't know and they're figuring it out. So for me, it's just interesting to see them go on that journey and figure it out step by step by step, and like each little thing just more pounds in the fact that this is super dangerous. Like the helicopter scene, and that whole thing, and then it just drops, and they're like, wow, like
It disintegrated.
Right, I never knew
Yeah.
that was possible.
I didn't
They
either.
didn't know that was possible. Like, they said earlier in the episode that this is something that never has happened before on the planet ever. So
Yeah.
That was a great
how do
line.
you deal with that?
Right, exactly. And the story gets away from them because there's satellite images and things. So we see two news broadcasts that I think do a good job. We see an archival Peter Jennings newscast from ABC News, and in that he says that the Soviets may have been quick to admit it because there was already evidence across the borders in Scandinavia. So once it got past the Iron Curtain and there were indications that something had happened and you were able to piece it all together, they would, I think the story, if they could have contained it, it never would. We wouldn't even know about Chernobyl. If they had had their way, we would never have known that it happened. But obviously they weren't able to do that. And I think from just sort of a media appreciation standpoint, Julana, let's talk about, there's that American broadcast, and then there's the very buttoned down Soviet state television female reporter. Talk a little bit about watching that.
Yeah, it just struck me as very lame and very boring. And I was watching the show with my boyfriend. I was like, wow, that is the lamest news report ever. And he goes, yeah, that's communism.
Yeah.
And I was like, well, I guess that sums it up. But it was very just dry and it didn't really give you anything. It was just sentences with like no meaning behind it.
Yeah. So they're able to convince the powers that be that they do need to evacuate. And Jeremy, I wanted to kind of get your thoughts that when the buses pull into town and the truck is going around, that announcement is in Russian. So we don't get it with subtitles. I found that to be an interesting choice, just from a TV production / storytelling standpoint. What did you think as that kind of unfolded? And it's like, we're not going to tell you what they're saying. You're just going to figure it out by watching.
Yeah, I think we might have. I don't know if I think the episode title, it is "Stay Calm," right?
Yes.
And if I had to bet, I would say that was a part of the translation, and they did stay calm. And I think it relates to the fact that there are a lot of people that in their living memory had evacuated the Ukraine.
Yeah.
And had to do that for World War II. It is something different than the American experience. We do have. I remember my lifetime when I think more people wanted to wait out hurricanes, and now I think there's much more insistence of evacuate and get out of there. I don't know if that was the norm in the Soviet Union at the time, but in this occasion, when they decided to do it, the people left. The people only took the one bag. The people handed over their dogs, and we saw a number running around. They were not fighting to take a dog on the bus and take more possessions. So it happened orderly. They had public transit, I would bet almost every bus from Kiev, thousands of buses that took them out. So in the immediate vicinity, they had a great job, but we're going to talk in a little bit about what their full job might have been if they had to evacuate, and that would have been a lot more and would have tapped them out. It would have been almost impossible.
And then just sort of following the timeline of the episode, this is the next major incident that we have. There's the moment when I was talking about two really important moments for Legasov. The other one is when he's at the hotel bar, and that couple is like, they just see him and they're like, "Oh, Moscow," which I think is interesting because I'm like, I mean, he's he's a British guy. He's pretending.
Yeah.
I don't know what about
He had a
him.
British Moscow accent.
What about him said Moscow? Is it the way that he was drinking his vodka? Which, by the way, he's like, no, I want one of the clean glasses, please, not something that you just rinsed off. Which at any bar, by the way, I don't want the one that I just saw you rinse off.
You know what I think it was actually? She had some of the glasses face down or opening down, and some were sitting opening up.
And he
I think
wanted
it
the
was
face down one,
where no dust could come into it.
So at that moment, Julana, she asks if anything we got to worry about, and there's a couple different ways that you can handle it, but talk about his decision for how he responds and what must have gone into that for him.
Right. I thought it was interesting, and I was very surprised that his character responded the way he did and said, no, everything is fine, because, you know, given how worked up he was about telling everybody else the truth, I think this is the moment where he grasped the fact that if I tell these people the truth, all it's going to do is cause a panic and a frenzy to them, and I'm kind of maybe doing them a disservice. So maybe I should just protect their happiness if I can't change the outcome and I know what's going to happen, and just let them go about their lives.
And of course, tragically, it's also kind of too late. Like the time to get out was the night before. So I think that and again the little behind the scenes production stuff that was after the episode, they talk about that's the moment where he becomes a part of the conspiracy, the cover up. He's invested in fixing this problem and having it go away. So Khomyuk just doesn't roll off the tongue, but she points out what the problem was with Legasov's, his theory, which is that the tanks are full of water, and he didn't take that into consideration. He didn't take into consideration that he didn't know that was the case. So that changes everything, because that was what you were talking about earlier, Jeremy, in terms of the explosion and the steam. So this is when we get to what I talked about in the intro, which is this idea that people who know the plant have to go in and manually, turn a lever so that this water from the tanks drains out. Otherwise, that's going to happen. So we have them seeking volunteers. Legasov offers 400 rubles a year, an annual stipend of 400 rubles. So there's kind of a lot to unpack in that turn of events, Jeremy, and I wanted to kind of let you talk about that, because I know you have a few things that are related to that.
So what's interesting is a lot of people don't know the economic history of the Soviet Union, and maybe even what 400 rubles means, and that's per year. For people that, I think, even though they didn't say it in the meeting, these people know radiation. They know dosimeters, and they've seen people around them already get sick and some die. 400 rubles at that time was $520 per year.
Right.
So that was, and today that would be about $1,200 for what these people would know is going to drastically shorten their life, even though they don't know all the ins and outs of radiation. They work in a nuclear power plant. They know enough. And what was really interesting to me is we have the line that we hear in the trailer and in the previews from Stellan Skarsgård's Boris character, where he talks about every generation has to know its suffering. And I thought that was probably something delivered to party officials, but he delivered it directly to the workers, saying this job has to be done. It's dangerous, and someone is going to do it because it's the job of essentially a Soviet to do it. It was very different than the way I thought he would deliver to a very different audience, but then the three people stepped up.
Right. I mean, I think that's the point he's making, is like, this is what sets us apart. We're the Soviet Union. We are going to have three people stand up, and they're going to do this for the greater good. And, like 3 Americans would never do it. Which, I wouldn't do it. I think it makes, these 3 men who, we get their names. So that tells me that I'm going to just assume that that's accurate, that these are the 3 guys who go in. But I think that this is the final scene of the episode, and then we'll get to our special segment. where they're going around and it's just lit by flashlights, which, Jeremy, I don't know, that might be reminiscent of another show you do here at AfterBuzz, where I understand they had a whole episode to take place in the dark. I'm talking about Game of Thrones, in case you don't know.
This wasn't the whole episode, though, and I think
this
it
was
was
just
for
like
more
3
effect.
minutes. Yeah. I thought that it was visually, it was really interesting, Julana, that it was just lit by the flashlights. Talk about how well they captured what that must have been like for you personally as you watched it.
Well, horrifying. I mean, just really scary. I really felt what it would be like to be those 3 men down there with just your flashlights. Obviously, they have some familiarity with where they were, but still, I mean, they have full scuba suits on. They only have flashlights, and they have a detector, right, that's going off the walls.
Is that a Geiger counter, or what is that? That's,
Dosimeter or Geiger
dosimeter,
counter?
Yeah.
one of those.
I don't know the difference.
And
between
it's
the
great that great from our standpoint, not great for their life expectancy, that the thing starts going crazy the closer and closer they get. It's getting darker. That thing's getting louder. They can't talk to each other. So yeah, just the confusion, and it's a relatively like controlled chaos, if it were, because they're not running. This isn't, they're in a dark tunnel and there's a monster after them. No, they're heading into something that they know is really their sure death. But I think that just the sounds mixed in with the breathing and the Geiger counters, and then the flashlights go out, obviously, because they get too close. I don't know, Jeremy, talk about what you thought, basically, when the episode ends.
If I have a phobia, it's claustrophobia. And literally it was bad enough just being in the tunnels, being confined. If you remember another, I think it was a 90s movie, but The Abyss.
Sure,
With
yeah.
with scenes in close quarters and leaking submarines. And I kept remembering that scene of the dripping water coming up on them, not knowing where an exit is, and if they had to get out, just knowing that they're being confined to their death. That as a semi-claustrophobe, that was really scary for me. I do hope and think they have some backup flashlights, but I guess we'll see in the next episode.
Yeah. Well, we're limited on time, but I want to take a couple minutes to get to our special segment, which is if I knew the Russian for by the numbers, I would call this segment that, but I didn't think to Google that until right now. But watch me say it next week. Jeremy, give us some of this. There's a lot of numbers thrown around in this episode, and then you also dug a little deeper. So let's talk a little bit about some of what you found.
Yeah, we've already talked about some of the numbers on the explosion and how much more powerful that just the steam would have made it than the Hiroshima bomb. But what did that do? What was the potential for that to do in terms of immediate destruction and then uninhabitability? The characters talk about that a lot, and they list 6 or 7 Eastern European countries, some in the Soviet Union and some that were a part of the Warsaw Pact and the Eastern Bloc. And those add up to about 1,700 million square kilometers, which is about 700,000 square miles. So to put that into context of what they said would be essentially uninhabitable, which over a period of weeks you'd probably have to evacuate, which would not be able to be habitable for 100 years or more.
Yeah, I remember
that's
you said that,
about 1/3 the size of the USA. So essentially, almost all the way from the Pacific Ocean, from California to almost the Rocky Mountains. So essentially, that whole segment of the United States uninhabitable. And what, in terms of the 60 million people that would have been affected of immediate danger just over the next few days of that explosion in just the Ukraine and Belarus, or today Belarus, then Belarusian Republic. Russia was a huge republic within the Soviet Union. European Russia was more densely populated, and these were some of the most densely populated areas of the Soviet Union. And they had about 60 million people, which probably would have been about a quarter thereabouts of this whole Soviet population. That would be and they would have to move them out over the next few days. That'd be the equivalent of California, Washington, Arizona, Oregon, and Nevada being moved out in just a couple of days.
Right.
So equaling up about 60 million. That's why those people at the table were so scared. We're running the numbers. They had never seen numbers like that. Even advancing troops, you have days ahead of time. You can kind of predict it. This was something that was going to advance on them at the speed of the wind, if not faster.
Yeah, and I think that obviously that's really how they're able to convince Gorbachev when they're like, look, this is what's going to happen if we don't address this now, and, you know, here's what we need. And, you know, he has that, just the realization that, you know, we're asking you for permission to kill 3 men, and that was something I alluded to at the beginning. All victories come inevitably at a cost. So he never actually says, yes, go ahead and kill them, but it's like, yeah, that's what I'm telling you.
He was doing the math with the 3 men versus that 60 million that was referenced.
And that's the final question that I want to ask you, Julana. Just when he says that, and just his sort of like matter-of-fact response of, yeah, you're going to have to kill these 3 guys. Your thought as you're watching that unfold.
I mean, I understand why, you know, like we
Yeah.
were talking about being an official in that position, you really don't have a choice. Because my first thought when you're running all those numbers is, where do you even put 60 million people?
Right. Yeah.
Nowhere. You know, like the amount of other problems that would, imagine shoving 60 million people into other countries, into other areas. And then, you know, there's food shortages. Like there's so many other problems that come with that.
Yeah.
So he really has no choice.
And you felt bad for Gorbachev in the earlier scene about walking out of that meeting. So then he walks out of this meeting and he's like, all right, I just hope I don't have to kill anybody in the next meeting.
I know. I felt like I needed to take
Yeah.
a drink for him. I was stressed out.
There's a lot more that we'll be able to dive into in the weeks ahead. But we are out of time for this evening. But we appreciate everybody who joined us. Julana, where can people find you?
You guys can find me on Instagram at Julana.
And Jeremy, you don't like to be found, do you?
You can find me here, and you can find me on Sunday on the
Oh.
Game of Thrones after show.
And that's the series finale. So then,
Series finale, and we'll probably take it one more into overtime.
well, that would probably make sense. There's probably a lot to unpack. And you can find me on Twitter and Instagram at ChristianDMZ. And Thursday nights, the Twilight Zone after show at 10 Pacific here at AfterBuzz TV. Thanks so much, and we will see all of you next Tuesday at 9 Pacific. Thanks.
Our founder, Kevin Undergaro, and me, Maria Menounos, would like to thank you for tuning in to AfterBuzz TV. Remember, we're not just the first, we're the biggest in the world, and we're the only destination for all your favorite TV shows. Whatever you crave, we've got it. So go to AfterBuzzTV.com and check out our lineup. Buzz you later.
The views expressed herein are those of the hosts only and do not necessarily reflect the views of AfterBuzz TV or its owners or principals.